I have so far introduced some issues of South Korean foreign policies, particularly on the security issue and economic development of policies. Now, I'm going to conclude with this section with introducing some problems of South Korean trade and trade patterns. First problem of South Korean trade is the high dependence on trade. Let me introduce trade to GDP ratio by countries, the percentage of trade out of the GDP. South Korean ratio is almost 79.8%. This means that 78% of South Korean GDP is made out of trade. This is huge, that's too high. But Germany, 71%. These two countries are the highest trade to GDP ratio countries in the world. France, 33%, China, 41%, UK, 38%, Japan, 32%, US, 23%. This means that these countries have enough size of domestic economy. So if they have some problems with trade, they can sustain, they can be maintained by domestic activities or domestic economic activities. So Korea and Germany are influenced heavily by external environment. So their economies are very vulnerable to external pressure, such as global economic crises or oil price hike. So these two economies are mostly vulnerable to external pressure in the world economies. Second problem of Korean trade is the high dependence on neighbors. Let's look at some statistics. South Korean exports by countries. China, 27%. US, 15%. Vietnam, 9.8%. Hong Kong, 6.2%. Japan, 5%. India, 2.4%. Singapore, Germany, Malaysia, Mexico. All these countries are located in Asia or US. So South Korea needs to expand to trade to other continents, particularly Europe or Latin America. What about imports? 24% of South Korean imports comes from China, 13% from the US, 10% from Japan, 4.6% from Germany, same thing Vietnam, Australia, Saudi Arabia. Almost same thing. Geographically, South Korean trade is limited only in the Asian continent or Eurasia. It's a serious problem too. Again, South Korea should expand the target countries for imports to other continents, Middle East and Latin America and Europe. I illustrated again the 10 important exporting partners and importing partners. If we look at the South Korean trade dependence and trend of South Korean dependence, I could not find recent data on other internet sources. Year 2000, this is the statistics of the import and export combined. In South Korean economy, trade depended on China only 9%. And 8 years later, 19%, 20%, and 2016, 23%. But because of the Chinese economic sanction with the THAAD conflict, probably South Korean trade dependence on China has decreased a little bit, almost about 22% in 2020. In the USA, 20%, the highest in about 20 years ago, and went down 10%, 10%, now 12%. So current statistics probably is almost same as this, about 12%. 12%. What about Japan? 20 years ago, almost 15% and went down, and currently probably 7% because of the bilateral disputes on history and strategies of security. So this is, again, this shows the too much dependence on neighbors and 3 countries. In other words, South Korean trade is heavily determined by geography. If we look at the flow of the money from trade in the Far East, Korea has trade deficit surplus with China, so money comes from China. And Korea has trade deficit with Japan. That money goes to Japan. Japan also has trade surplus with China, but Japan put investment to China. Also, Korea invests more money than Japan to China too. Japanese investment here, investment. And both countries do not invest much, not much. So anyway, the money goes in round and round, over here too, and over here too. So probably the money existing in Northeast Asia are circulating among these 3 countries. So they don't go far, they stay within this region. Another problem of South Korean trade is high dependence on few industries. It is directly related to the problem of Korean economy. If we look at the South Korean exports by category, the highest item is the electronic equipment, $160 billion a year. A second category is machinery, nuclear reactors and boilers, $68 billion. Third one is the vehicles other than railway or tram. So automobiles, passenger cars and buses and trucks, so 54 billion. And fourth is plastics, 31 billion. And the fifth is mineral fuels, oils, distillation products, $25 billion. So South Korean trade is concentrated on these 5 items. 5 items. So the items of these 5 categories take about 67.2, almost 70% of South Korean export in the year 2020. Can you believe it? These 5 categories take the almost 60% of South Korean export in 2020. Obviously, the South Korean economy should expand or multiply its target and strategic industries further. Is another table that shows the South Korean exports by category. Electronic equipment, 31%, machinery, 13%, vehicles, 11%, and plastics and minerals kind of stuff. And optical, photo, technical, medical apparatus, iron, and organic chemicals, and all these things. So it is concentrated on few categories of items. And the political obstacles, I think, which is the very significant factor in South Korean economy and also trade. Some political issues often become a major obstacle in the Korean trade, particularly with China and Japan. With China, the THAAD problems, and the following Chinese economic sanction against South Korea. And also, Japan sometimes put the economic sanctions against South Korea, largely because of the historical problems, sex slaves, and territorial disputes. And also, I have to mention the rising nationalism among those countries. In Korea, anti-Japan sentiments, anti-Chinese sentiments. In China, anti-Japanese, anti-Korean sentiments. In Japan, anti-Korea, anti-Chinese sentiments. So these three Far Eastern countries hate each other. And also, it is largely because of the history problems and particularly the manipulation by the politicians, Korea, Japan, and China. Also, maybe it's a slight problem, but there's not increasing, anti-American sentiments in Korea. Sometimes it affects the bilateral trade between the ROK and US.